Consumers concerned about their personal information can now breathe a sigh of relief as President Cyril Ramaphosa has proclaimed sections of the Protection of Personal Information Act into law. This after the presidency announced sections of the act will now come into effect on the 30th of June and the 1st of July respectively. The Protection of Personal Information Act provides that everyone has the right to privacy and tries to strike a fine balance between the right to privacy and the right to access information. Now, to help us understand what this means, I'm joined via Skype by Murray Hunter, who is a data privacy activist. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Murray. Perhaps let's backtrack a little bit and talk about the issues and the circumstances that have led to a law of this nature, an act of this nature being put into place.
You know, it's important to take a step back because, in fact, this law has been years in the making and, in fact, has been waiting to be implemented for some, actually it predates the Ramaphosa administration. But what this really is about is recognizing that globally there's been a shift towards digitization of pretty much every service, every platform, so many parts of public life. There is a great need to protect the personal information of every person who's every person. And so South Africa is joining a global trend of countries that are implementing what they call data protection laws, which essentially lay down new rules around how government agencies, private companies, other organizations can collect or not collect and process people's personal information. And so what is happening from next week, the 1st of July, is that there will be quite a slow implementation process, a full 12 months before it becomes enforced, before there are these new laws in place that say a company cannot collect your information without your permission, it cannot use your information for reasons you haven't agreed to, and it can't store the information unless you've agreed to that as well.
Now, there are certain aspects of the POPIA Act that are actually going to start being implemented. Which sections of the Act are going to start being rolled out now?
Well, essentially, the bulk of the law will now be implemented over this 12-month period. And what that provides for is that no organization or person, whether it's a government or a private entity, can collect or use your information unless it's following the rules of, the guidelines provided for in this law. And that is about when they can and can't collect the information, how they can and can't use it, how they need to store it if they have collected it, and the rights they give you once they hold the information. So, for example, if a company is holding information about you that you don't think they should hold, you have the right to tell them to delete it and destroy it. And what will happen, what will happen over this 12-month grace period that essentially kicks in from next week is that there will now be enforcement of those laws. And there's a watchdog body called the Information Regulator that we would be looking to ensure that government agencies and private companies are actually following the letter of the law here.
Now, in a practical sense, as a consumer, how do I regulate or even report organizations who still continue to call you without your permission?
So that's such an important point. And you said earlier that consumers can breathe a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, what we're seeing globally is that these kinds of laws are only enforced when citizens demand that they're enforced. And so regulators require a very active citizenry to understand what the law says and to act on it. And so what you asked practically what this means is that at any point you come across a company or a government agency that is not following the privacy laws in place, which we call the POPIA Act, you complain to this watchdog body called the Information Regulator. You ask for an investigation. That investigation needs to happen, and you need to get the outcome. And what this requires is a huge amount of resources. It requires a very vigilant watchdog agency, and it requires citizens to be taking action and ensuring that their rights are enforced. So this is a law that can protect our privacy if we demand it, if we use it. And as I think in the pandemic, obviously this law was produced before the pandemic came to be, but we're only seeing an acceleration of the kind of digitization of all these services, and that does mean that more personal information is being distributed out there, and we really need this law to be enforced as quickly as possible.
This is really widespreading if you consider the fact that so many industries are actually hedged on the dissemination and the use of information. They're telemarketers, for example. So this would adversely affect those type of industries. Break that down for us.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, particularly the financial services sector, particularly the kinds of sectors that profit off the fact that South Africa is a very South African citizens are very vulnerable to debt collectors, to sort of small loan sharks and things like this. These are industries that have been built off of our private information and without our consent. And so to the extent that those industries are operating essentially without caring what users think about how their personal information is being used, that business needs to change. So that you've mentioned this as a consumer law. It obviously does affect consumers, but it's actually about human rights. It's about how our personal information can be used in an election, for example. It's about how our personal information can be used in financial services. It's about how our personal information can be used by our government as well. So this is something that cuts across, so many parts of public life, and that really speaks to the fact that however we're interacting with the world, whether it's through a business, through local government, or through social media, we are handing out personal information, and we need a law there that protects our rights when our information gets out there.
In another practical way, how would this work? Because the information is already out there. There are companies that have been doing this, and this has been their business for decades now. They've got your phone number. So what does it mean come the 30th of July, or the 30th of June and the 1st of July? Does it mean that you can no longer get a phone call with somebody offering you a special deal? Will they now expressly have to get your permission in order to be able to do that?
We would hope so. What this means is that, yes, from the 30th of July, from the 30th of June, 1st July, we would want to see companies being compliant with the letter of the law of POPIA, which says they cannot collect your information without permission, they cannot use your information for any purpose you haven't agreed to, and if you want them to delete that information, they're obliged to delete it. Unfortunately, the part of it that is difficult is that there is a 12-month period in which gives these companies time to get essentially their houses in order. What we would want is, and so what that means is in 2021, that is when the enforcement takes effect. That's when you can complain to the information regulator and say, there's a company that is not obeying the letter of the law, that is using my personal information in a way I haven't agreed to. You need to investigate. You need to protect my rights. And it is going to take a lot for citizens to get behind this, to ensure that the right resources are getting to that watchdog, to ensure that that watchdog is acting on complaints and that industries are actually complying.
Well, thank you so much. So basically, these companies have a year for you to tell them not to call you anymore.
I would hope that we would want to see them acting much more swiftly than that, because what will happen in a year is that finally the letter of the law will have some teeth and have some force behind it, and that will be that will mean that if they don't comply, they will face consequences, fines, for non-compliance.
And businesses that are operational in this space, clearly it would mean a relook at how they operate, how they are constituted, because they can no longer go ahead business as usual. Do you foresee perhaps some of these data companies, data collection companies closing down or remodeling themselves in some way?
That's a very interesting question. And we must remember that a lot of companies this law has been in the making for many years. And so a lot of the big data industries have effectively been, rewriting their policies, or at least on paper, for many years now. So, your Discoveries, your Standard Banks, or whatever, they have been developing their policies for quite some time. But we would want to see, at this point, really, companies need to be able to explain why they haven't got their houses in order until now, because they have known this is coming. But we don't think, unfortunately, I don't think it would be realistic to say that these industries are going to slow down, because there is so much money to be made in trafficking people's personal information. And so what really needs to change is that citizens need to start to take cognizance of what is in that law and to start to act on it.